Okay, if you recall from last time, we got up just about as far as, what, the 9th century,
yes.
if I recall?
And
then we were thrown out, yes. The doles, Bob the doles.
It's Monty Python.
So I would like to kind of get us caught up and then talk a little bit about the Reformation up through present day. So again, tall order, a lot of history to cover. And the main reason I just want to really re-explain why we're kind of doing the historical survey that we're doing before we actually get into the prayer book itself. As we work our way through the prayer book, I'll keep referring back to some of this material. And I'll be like, all right, so you remember how we talked about how baptism was a big deal in the early church? So that kind of thing will keep coming up again and again and again. So, real quick, just to sort of get us up to speed, by the time you get into the first 100 years or so of the new millennium, you've got a distinctive tradition in the West. You've got a distinctive tradition in the East. We are really going to be concerned with the Western Christian tradition because that's kind of where we come from. Okay, but there's an awful lot to be said about the Eastern traditions and we'll get to that in a second with the architectural piece, which is I'm jazzed about. But anyway, in the Western tradition, by and large, by the time you get to the turn of the millennium, the liturgies are all in Latin. It has become a very exclusive thing where the priests do the work, or the bishops and the priests and the deacons do the work. If there are professional choirs, then the choirs have their own jobs. They know what they're doing. The laity are completely removed from active participation in worship. And so that's what that does is it creates a sort of professional class of ministers. And we'll get into this with the Reformation. But you can see why this might be a problem. Because you've gone from these private gatherings in small settings where everyone, yes, has their sort of place and everyone's doing a different function, but everyone does have a job. Everyone has a liturgy that they are performing. The people's job, way back when, was actually involved. It was not just sort of sit down and watch and have church done to you as opposed to participating in church. Okay? That is a big theme that I think we'll keep coming back to again and again and again and again and again. So, the first little paragraph, the one little thing that I will mention is that monasteries, across Western Europe, monasteries are the sort of the sole and exclusive practitioners of the daily office. Okay? And so daily prayer, morning prayer, evening prayer that we have right now. In the monasteries, it's very involved routines. Matins, lauds, terce, sex, known, vespers, compline, and something. What's that?
Making the beer too.
And making the beer. So, yes. But no, but that's actually a very important point though, Charlie, because in the monasteries, you've got this distinction between lay brothers and choir monks. And lay brothers are technically speaking monks, but they don't read. And so they can't sing and participate in the liturgy. And so even in the monasteries, and it's the sole purview of the monks to do the daily office, to pray, you've got some of the monks who actually do the grunt work, as it were, brewing the beer, making the bread, shearing the sheep, that sort of thing. And then you've got the choir monks whose professional duty it is just to pray. In fact, in the monastery of Cluny, you're all familiar with the monastery of Cluny, by the turn of the millennium, Cluny has become so complicated in terms of its liturgy, just its liturgy, that the only way you could actually participate is if you were born at the monastery. Not get into how that happens, but if you grow up in the monastery, participating in the choir services of the monastery, it's the only way you can figure out how complicated the liturgy gets. So if that gives you some sense of kind of what we're dealing with as things develop, that's what we're looking at. So, Again, worship has become exclusive. Yeah.
Did they do it on purpose to keep people out?
No, it was not to keep people out. It's sort of, I'm trying to think what a good analogy would be nowadays. If you've got... Do you know anyone that plays Dungeons and Dragons? Okay, so if you play Dungeons and Dragons, that can get incredibly complicated. All the rules and all the different little facets of how things work gets more and more intricate the farther in you go. And so it wasn't to just, keep people out, because you were welcome to come in, but when you started digging down into the complexities of the liturgy, it got so convoluted. Perfect example that I can give even now. When I was up in Michigan, the Benedictine monastery where I was did the full round of Matins Lauds Terce Vespers Compline. And it took me about 2 years before I could figure out exactly where we were supposed to be in all the service books. Because it changes on a seasonal basis, and all the canticles change, and all the different psalmody. And anyway, it's designed to be complicated. I guess that's the only way to put it. Because if you want to, glorify God according to the season, and you want to change all your stuff and shift everything, and we do a little of that, bit of that here. Sometimes altar guilds will come in on a Sunday and you'd be like, what color are we using? And it's because it can be complicated, right? It's, we've gone from Advent to Christmas to Epiphany to Lent to Easter, and there's saints' days in between, and it can get really complicated. That's another thing worth pointing out. By the time you get to the Reformation, even though you've got a uniform liturgy across Western Europe, you've also got the multiplication of these small festivals. So who all here knows the story of St. Lucy? St. Lucy or Lucia? Okay, well that's okay. In the church, you've got about 4,000 saints, okay, by the 1400s. And how many days in the year do you have? 365. And so basically you could go through the entire year, and it's a saint's day, and you feast on the saint's day, and so there's never any fast days, there's never any days to just kind of be cool. It's always a party, and this is a problem. This is a big problem. So anyway, what you wind up with at the turn of the Reformation, again, is this exclusive liturgy is for the clergy, the professional class, and the laity have church done to them or for them. Okay. I do want to make an interesting little aside, and I'll pass this around. One of my hobbies is architecture, church architecture in particular. So, and what I want to point out is one of the things that is also driving the liturgical developments within the church has an impact on how churches are built and the way in which churches are constructed. So, for instance, in the churches of the East, so the Eastern Orthodox churches, you could make a very strong argument that, and this is a typical layout of a typical Orthodox church, even to this day, okay? Even to this day. So, what you have is a sense of God's immanence. There's still mystery. In fact, mystery in the Orthodox traditions is paramount. But there's a sense of God's immanence, or God's closeness, or God's being right with us, incarnate around us. And so when you walk into an Eastern Orthodox church, the first thing that you'll probably notice is it's not very tall. Okay, if there's a vaulted ceiling, it's not going to be like, oh, wow, grand, amazing Gothic archways. What you've got is sort of chairs on the side, standing room, because everyone is supposed to remain standing for the liturgy. And that's based on a passage from the book of Revelation. It's not haphazard. Like, you're supposed to stand in the presence of God. So the bishop's throne or the priest's chair is actually with the people. Okay, that's number 15 on this model here. Okay, if you notice, actually, I should go back a little bit. If you notice, the first thing that you see when you'll walk in, the chair's off the side. There's a partition wall. Okay, that's 17. The royal doors. You remember how I talked last week about in the early days of the church, baptism was your entrance into the church. Everyone was welcome to come into a church building, but when it came to the Eucharist, you were supposed to leave. Orthodox churches, at least if they're designed correctly, still to this day, have these royal doors. And if you're a catechumen or learning about the faith, you remain outside. And in the liturgies of the East, to this day, there is a point in the service where they say, the doors, bar the doors, and the catechumens must leave. And so you close the doors so that the catechumens are not experiencing the Eucharist with everybody else.
Do they come back in after the Eucharist?
And that's pretty much the end of the service, because after the Eucharist begins, once the Eucharist is over, you go back out. So anyway, on straight up, you've got this another partition wall, and that's called the iconostasis or the beautiful gate. And that really is, the Eucharist is happening behind that. So no one sees it apart from the priests. Okay? So that becomes the Eastern Orthodox way of saying, this is really just for the priests and the laity aren't supposed to participate. In the West, there's something called a rood screen. Have y'all ever been into like a typical Gothic church, like an English Gothic church or an English cathedral? Okay, I should have brought a picture. Anyway, the Eucharist happens behind these gates in the Eastern Orthodox churches. In the West, by the same sort of time that we're talking about, what you end up having is a sort of partition as well that the people are not allowed to go beyond. Some of these screens actually have holes cut into them so that the people can see what's happening, but they don't actually receive. They don't receive the Eucharist. So, the difference between an Eastern Orthodox church and a typical Western-style church by about the 1400s, if you go into a typical English Gothic or Western European Gothic church, what do you notice? Stained glass windows, right? Yep. So, that's to lift your eyes to heaven. Okay? It's designed that way. It's designed, light is well, yeah, no, and this technically speaking, this is a Gothic style building, because it's got a pointed arch and your eyes are drawn up. There's a theological reason for that. If you're no longer participating in the liturgy, if you're no longer a participant in what happens during worship, and you're supposed to be meditating on the transcendence and amazing, overwhelming beauty of God, the building is going to help you do that, and the buildings are reacting to the development of theology and worship. So there's all of this stuff sort of comes together. And again, this.
St. Paul's Church.
What's that?
St. Paul's Church, the Bishop's Church.
Yeah.
That big old circle, so
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yes. St. Paul's would be a modern Gothic church. So again, that's most churches in the West, even if they're sort of small chapels, still have that same, lifting your eyes upward because of the transcendence of God. Because if you're not participating in the Eucharist, if you're not receiving the Eucharist, there's no sense that God is with us. God is above us. And so, anyway, I think that's a fascinating little trip down the architectural road. So, we're at the Reformation. Reformation starts early 1500s. I'm sure y'all are familiar with Martin Luther and those 95 Theses, that whole business. Just to sort of hone in on what we're dealing with here. When the Reformation begins, one of the things that a lot of these reformers are interested in is how do we redirect our worship? Because part of the problem is that the worship of the Catholic Church has become corrupt, or it's become untenable, or it's become unuseful. And so how do we fix our worship to be more sort of what we're trying to do for the people? So Luther comes in, and a lot of his experiments are conservative in nature. He takes what's there. He takes what's in the Catholic Church's liturgical round, and he just says, all right, let's fix it. We don't have to overhaul the whole system. Let's keep what's good, and minor reforms were necessary. Okay. Then you've got someone like John Calvin, who is Swiss, French, Swiss Reformed tradition, and it's overhaul the whole system. Throw out the whole stink and let's start from scratch and rebuild it up. And this is a gross overgeneralization, by the way, but we don't really have time to get all into the details. So Cranmer, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury under Henry VIII, comes in, and his approach is basically, we need to overhaul everything. We need to fix this. But let's take everything that's good from the old system, incorporate some of what Luther's talking about, incorporate some of what Calvin's talking about, and bring it together into a coherent system. Okay? So, he is the Archbishop under Henry VIII. How many of y'all know about Henry VIII? He got married to who lived next door. She'd been married 7 times before. Everyone was a Henry. Anyway. No. Henry VIII. What's interesting about Henry VIII, and this guy is way more complicated than I think most of us give him credit for. Early on in his career, when Martin Luther began to sort of start making noises over in Germany, he wrote a theological attack on Lutheran doctrine or Lutheran theology. And as a result of that, the Pope at the time named Henry VIII, defender of the faith. Okay? So Henry is a sort of stalwart Catholic supporter of all things Catholic until he needs to get a divorce. Okay? And then he's kind of like, well, maybe this whole Reformation thing's not a bad idea. And so he starts to kind of go down the road of let's explore this Reformation theology and see how it can help me out. He's also motivated by the political, he thinks, necessity of getting a divorce. We won't go into why that was something that came across his mind, but that was the driving force sort of behind his breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. When that break happens, he and Cranmer are working in tandem, and there's a lot of other people that are taking part in this. But they basically start down the road of reform. How do we reform the liturgy that we're currently using in England, which is Catholic until the break happens, but they're still using the liturgy of the Catholic Church, because you don't just say, we're done, and then all the books are changed magically tomorrow. We're going to keep using what we've got, but we're going to start to look at the process of reform. Okay? So, he agrees to this, and it starts going down the road. Married to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn is a Protestant through and through. And then something goes wrong with that relationship. And she winds up a few inches shorter. And guess what happens after Anne Boleyn dies? Henry puts the brakes on the Reformation. Cranmer was actually in danger of losing his life. Henry was a sort of happy axe swinger, and Cranmer could have wound up on the chopping block. Not fortunately, but fortunately for us, I guess, for the prayer book, he didn't. So, anyway, once Henry realizes that the ship has already sailed and this reform stuff is continuing, he's like, all right, we're going to rein it in a little bit. It's not going to be as thorough as some people want it to be. But anyway, the result of all of this sort of turmoil and rumbling and grumbling and back and forth with Henry winds up with the first Book of Common Prayer. Henry dies in 1547. Okay, his son Edward, who was a minor, takes the throne. There's a regency, and the first prayer book comes out in 1549. Okay, some of the salient points of 1549. a lot of what is in the 1549 Book of Common Prayer is essentially just, cutting and pasting or translating from the old Catholic liturgy into English. And so what you wind up getting is mostly a sort of Catholic prayer book in English. And the main thing that they were worried about with the Book of Common Prayer is making sure that it's accessible to the people. And so the liturgy in the vernacular is the big deal. Okay? Now, even though it's limited, the people are asked to participate more fully in the liturgy. So, for instance, when I say, "The Lord be with you," okay, lift up your hearts. All right, so you guys know this response, okay? Not the case prior to this first Book of Common Prayer. The liturgy was done by a priest and an acolyte. And so that when the priest said, "Dominus tecum," the acolyte's response was, "Et cum spirito tuo." What the heck does that mean? Nobody's paying attention to this. All they care about is seeing the magic cookie.
From early communion.
Yes.
Confirmation. I didn't know what they were all of it was Latin in the Catholic Church.
Yes.
You know what academics say?
Yeah. That didn't
And
change.
for a while it just came from opticians.
Yes.
Knew it.
Yes. And that did not change until the 1960s
That's right.
in the Roman Catholic Church. But anyway, we'll get to that, down the line. Anyway, the main thing to remember about 1549, it puts the liturgy in the vernacular. It puts the liturgy in the hands of the people, kind of. The priests are still running the show, but it's, there is a little bit more involvement. 1549 also presupposes, and this is very important, that people receive the Eucharist. Now that's key, because prior to that, the people did not receive the Eucharist. The people witnessed the bread and the wine, and they saw it, and that was it. And the priest took it, and the acolyte maybe, but that was it. There was no involvement from the laity. Also, in 1549, baptism becomes paramount. So prior to 1549, baptism had become this private thing that was done off to the side. Baby was born, celebrate it, great. Private baptism with just a few family members. It was never done within the context of worship. 1549 changes that. It says when a child is born, you celebrate, blah, whatever. Then the child is baptized on a Sunday in the context of the congregation gathering and receiving this child into the church. And so there's this shift that's beginning to happen. And all of this is based upon the idea that we're going back to ancient sources. Okay, it might be overemphasizing the importance of what Cranmer did in 1549, but it's interpreted by some as being too Catholic. Even Cranmer himself apparently thought that his first prayer book was too Catholic. And so 3 years later, we get the prayer book of 1552. It tries to scrub out some of the more Catholic interpretations. It cleans up some of the rubrics. Do y'all know what rubrics are? Okay, rubrics. It's the rules. They're printed in red. In the first Book of Common Prayer, in all sort of liturgical manuals, the rubrics are printed in red, hence the name rubric. And they are the sort of notes of explanation around how you're supposed to do stuff. So it's explaining the rules of how church goes. Like if you're supposed to kneel here, that's written in red and in italics. Okay. Anyway, the 1552 prayer book cleans up some of the language, made more specific. It imports some more Calvinistic theology that's sort of going around at the time. It's a bit more Protestant in feel. Cleans up the rubrics. So, Edward VI dies. Mary Tudor, or Bloody Mary, comes to the throne. The Book of Common Prayer is outlawed. She reinstates Roman Catholic worship in England, and then she dies. Okay, her half-sister Elizabeth comes to the throne. Elizabeth reinstates the Book of Common Prayer, and it's revised in small ways in 1559, and that's what's known as the Elizabethan settlement.
All that happened in 10 years?
I know, that's a lot to happen in 10
I mean, the turmoil that's going on around this time, especially in England, the fact that anything survives at all is miraculous. So, and especially because what you wind up getting from Henry to Edward to Mary is this extreme ends are beginning to sort of become entrenched. That you've got, the staunch Catholic side and the staunch Protestant side that are saying, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. And so what Elizabeth does is she comes in and she says, this needs to stop. We have all got to get along somehow. And so what she's trying to do is hold both sides sort of at bay against one another and incorporate as much as she can from both sides in this new prayer book. The new prayer book of 1559 is a minor revision, but there's major points in it that you can see as concessions to the Catholics and concessions to the extreme Protestants. And so what you wind up getting is this you can call it a golden mediocrity, but it's a sort of sitting in the middle, trying to hold all sides against one another. Okay, sort of halfway down the page, I mentioned this Catholic versus Protestant or Anglicans versus Puritans. As Elizabeth's reign continues, and as it gets towards the end, and as she dies, the factions are beginning to smell blood again, and this will erupt in civil war in less than a few years. Okay.
I didn't understand the war. Catholic and Protestant seems to me like a one group, and Anglicans versus Puritan another.
Right, that's a good point, Monty. So the note that I've got here, Catholics versus Protestants or Anglicans versus Puritans. So depending on what party you belong to in the 17th century, you would refer to yourself as, well, I'm of the extreme Catholic variety, or I'm of the extreme Protestant varieties. They referred to themselves in these terms. Scholars also tend to sort of go with the designation of Anglican versus Puritan, because if you were an Anglican, you were not necessarily strongly Roman Catholic. You were Church of England by the time you get to Elizabeth's reign, and that meant that you were not Roman Catholic, that you hated the Roman Catholic Church, that you hated the Pope, etc., etc., but you were definitely not a friend of a Puritan. So you were, John Calvin would not have been your buddy either, more or less. I don't want to get in the weeds on that one. Anyway, so what you wind up getting by the time you reach 1662 is all of these different factions that are vying for supremacy in the Church of England. The 1662 Book of Common Prayer is doing kind of what Elizabeth was trying to do and hold everyone together. That we've got Catholic elements that we want to support, we've got Protestant elements that we want to support. No one's going to be entirely thrilled with how this works out, but we can pray together. Okay? One of the things that, and I forgot to put this quote out, the main thing to remember in the early iterations of the Book of Common Prayer is that it's rabidly anti-Catholic. Rabidly anti-Catholic. And the best example of that comes in the litany. So this litany is this long series of prayers. One of the prayers in the litany is, O Lord, preserve us from the Bishop of Rome and his detestable enormities. Okay? That's eventually gotten rid of. Okay? So by 1662, you've gotten rid of that kind of thing, but you've got this kind of, I don't want to say a golden mean, but that's essentially what it's trying to be. It's trying to be the best of the Catholic tradition, the best of the Protestant tradition, Calvinist tradition, and it's being held together in this prayer book that we are all supposed to use together, even though we might not all get along. Charlie?
Isn't that when the High Episcopal Church came in?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, in terms of the Episcopal Church of the United States, or so we're getting there. But yeah, I mean, high church. That's, if you trace that back, you can make an argument that high church traditions, wearing vestments, using incense, that sort of thing, that you can say that can be traced back probably to like the 1600s. Yeah, it begins back. Yeah. So, anyway, to sort of pertinent for what we're dealing with. The Church of England in the colonies. So the colonies are founded, things start going, and as long as England is in charge of America, guess what the established church is?
Church of England.
Church of England. So, at least in some places where there's not dissenting congregations. Anyway, there is a Church of England in the United States, with one exception: there are no bishops in America. Okay, there are no bishops in the colonies. That will become important later on. So, the Church of England in the colonies uses the Church of England's Book of Common Prayer of 1662, all the way through until we have a slight problem in 1776. What was that problem? 1776. What happens in 1776? The Declaration of Independence. Now, the Church of England is an established church, meaning that the monarch of England is the head of the church. What's the problem there? If you say, we're on our own, thanks, King, you no longer have a head of the church. And so this creates a little bit of a problem. According to the Book of Common Prayer of 1662, we're supposed to pray for the king. God save the king. Or queen. No, and but that's a problem. And so what the American church has to do is figure out, well, we don't disagree theologically with anyone over in England. What do we do? Because our prayer book presupposes that the king is the head of the church. So we have a problem. And so they get together, and in 1789 is the first American Book of Common Prayer. Okay, and basically that comes about as a result of the Americans getting together and going, hey, guys, we want to stay what we are. We'd like this Book of Common Prayer thing. Can it be adapted for our use? And there you go. How many of y'all have seen or heard Hamilton?
No.
The musical? No? Okay. So, if you ever do, okay, one of the characters in that musical is a guy named Samuel Seabury. He's a villain in the musical, but never mind. Samuel Seabury is a priest in Connecticut around the time of the Revolution, and he is a loyalist. He does not want the Americans to leave England, but it happens anyway, and he's kind of like, well, nuts. What do we do? Because if you're a Church of England entity and you need bishops, ruh-roh, you go get a bishop, right? Well, you don't have bishops in the States. All right, so how do you solve this problem? He sails to England. And he approaches all these English bishops, and he says, guys, we need to continue, the tradition of having bishops ordain priests and go on that way. And the bishops in England basically tell him, sorry, you can't take the oath of conformity to the king. So we're not going to ordain you. What does he do? And this is, I'm going to boast a little bit here. So I have Scottish heritage, and the Scots have a wonderful and long-lived tradition of basically thumbing their nose at the English and saying, we don't care what you want. And that's essentially what Samuel Seabury makes use of. He goes up north to Scotland and meets with Scottish Episcopal Church bishops. And there's a whole long history of the Scottish Episcopal Church that dates back to the same sort of, Reformation times. They develop as an independent sort of thing.